Welcome. If you remember in a previous video, we were in the process of testing all of the headway cells that you see here, or roughly about 160 of them, to turn them into packs and eventually be something that will either be added to the existing battery bank running the house or what will be the new battery bank that will be running the garage. And in the process of testing, you'll notice you'll see a lot of noise coming from the cooling fan on this iCharger. Basically, the bearings are getting ready to go out. Another gentleman on YouTube, Lithium Solar, had the same problem with his iCharger X6. This is an X8. I don't believe there's any other difference in the cooling fan other than this is just an 8-port serial, 8 series charger versus a 6-cell series charger. We went ahead and used Lithium's link to where he sourced cooling fans, and we're going to do the same cooling fan replacement on this X8. And I'll just power up the power supply here. That way you can kind of hear what that cooling fan's doing if you didn't already hear it in a previous video. And right there, it didn't sound too terrible. We're going to go ahead and put this into discharge mode, and we're just got another headway cell here on the testing table. And as that temperature heats up and gets to be about 103, you'll hear that cooling fan kick on. Usually it doesn't take very long because we're not using an external resistor bank with this iCharger. We're just using the internal. And we have this one set to be a 20 amp discharge. It usually hovers around 14 to 16 amps. And we're getting up there about 95 degrees and climbing. It's 98, 99, as you can tell. You are discharging to a bank of resistors on the inside, so it doesn't take them too terribly long to heat up. We're about 103. It should kick off here in a moment. Now that isn't too terrible. That's actually better than it has been, but you'll notice in the previous videos this is starting to sound kind of basically the bearings are going bad. It's a nice little grinding noise, and if you tap on the fan, there you go. That's it right there. You kind of get that old PC, definitely, bearings are going bad, time to replace your fan deal. I'm going to cut the video here, and then once we start getting this apart, then we'll come back and kind of show what we did step by step. For now, I'll talk to you later. So just one quick update in mine and getting the screen off, the little plastic cover that you can see there. In previous videos I've seen individuals were able to take advantage of a gap between the black plastic here and the plastic there and just kind of wedge a screwdriver underneath. I was kind of able to do the same, but what I had to do first was take a heat gun and heat up these outside edges, just passing it over, making sure not to get it too hot. Just about 3 minutes of passing it over, continuously keeping it moving on each side. Then we were able to get a screwdriver in underneath, and then gingerly, once you get it underneath one corner, slide the screwdriver forward. Pardon the camera work here, but I'm trying to hold the camera and do this at the same time. You'll hear that glue kind of give way. And you can probably hear it there a little bit. And I'm sliding this flat blade screwdriver on the very outer edges of this to avoid the LCD screen that is underneath. Kind of see the flat blade screwdriver right there, and again just sliding it underneath the edges. You can hear it there. You kind of hear where that glue is still sticking, but that's basically the process, and you can see there we're making some pretty good progress of getting this off. It's just sliding that screwdriver, which we're in a good spot, on the outer edges of that, and there we go. We've got it. And we'll come back in a bit. We've got our replacement cooling fan in, and as what happened on Lithium Solar's video, the replacement fan, this is actually a secondary one here, came with this nice long cable on it, but the connector that plugged into the board on the iCharger was a little bit too big, so we had to borrow the connector off the bad fan, and that's the fan that's getting ready to go out. And you can another way you can kind of tell on this one, and this is the fan. If you just kind of hold it, you may be able to see that in the camera, probably not, but there's a large amount of play in there. You can see that fan move quite a bit. Just again, it's just another indication of that bearing that's in there that's going bad. So what would happen was, this fan, as it was spinning, would occasionally walk outward or push outward and then hit up against this plastic guard that's actually on the outside. And this is the 5 volt 0.25 amp cooling fan. The replacement is also a 5 volt listed at 0.2 amp. It's a little bit less amperage, but it's supposedly rated for the same airflow as the original. This is the link that Lithium Solar provided in his video for the replacement fan. So I literally got the exact same set of fans, as it seems to work perfectly well for his X6. And as we theorized at the beginning of the video, there seems to be no difference between the cooling fan using an X6 versus an X8. So we trimmed down the wiring here a little bit and borrowed our connector off our old fan, and just did a little bit of soldering and a little bit of heat shrinking to get those two joined together. Now I left this a little bit longer than what it is factory when you take this apart. There's maybe the plug came out to about there originally, so you can see there's a little bit of excess wire here. Now I'm looking at how they constructed this, and this is the main board for the iCharger here. Where it plugs into is your heatsink. This is what comes into play when you're doing your discharging quite a bit. Charging as well, because I'm sure they got the voltage regulators heatsink to this, but the majority of that meat is for that discharge when you're using it upwards of potentially 30 amps. But that's just get off a side tangent here. That connector right there is where that cooling fan plugs into. Where it does is that this piece sits on here like this when it's attached to the case. So this plug comes around, will plug into that motherboard there, or main board, motherboard, however you want to call it. And then we're going to I'm just going to take this excess wire and just kind of coil it here on the side a little bit. It shouldn't interfere with the selector switch or get too close to anything and get any warmer than what it already was when it was in here. The original plug would have come down about that far and then plugged in. I'm just going to leave a little excess on here so that in the event that this cooling fan has to be replaced again, I can continue to reuse this connector, because it is quite a bit smaller than the default one that came with the fan. And I'm sure if you knew the part number, you can probably size these pretty well. But again, not knowing that just makes it a little difficult. Let's see what we got here. So we'll get this reassembled, and then we'll come back into the video here and I'll show you what was done on this cooling fan. Quickly before we go, since we're on this piece, Just be mindful of where the factory cooling fan's plug oriented itself out of, which corner. I picked this corner here. Again, this is the outside piece. This is how it sits, and that's where that plug will plug into. Now, I thought about doing this. I did not do this. You would have to test it. If you wanted to leave a little bit more meat on this wire, you could flip the fan so that the wiring come out on this side, and then just wrap the excess cabling around the outside of the fan and then plug it in. But just kind of be mindful of where that orients it. And if you do change it, make sure it's not going to interfere with anything around it or the ability to reassemble it in the case. But we'll... Okay, we've gotten our cooling fan put back in, and we've got our board back reinstalled. When you're putting your cooling fan back in, don't make the mistake that we did initially and put the fan in the wrong direction. Pay attention to your airflow. On the replacement fan, it was hard to see it because there weren't directional markings to show you the airflow. We noticed it after assembly when we were proofing this out, and noticed that the airflow was coming out of these vents here rather than being discharged here. And because initially, with the original fan, whenever we're using this unit, we notice the air gets pulled. It usually gets pulled into here and discharged out the fan, and it was working the opposite of that and causing this to get hotter than it should. So we had to disassemble it and swap this fan around. Also, when you're pulling this main board out and putting this main board in, these 4 screws here in the center do not need to come out. These are what attach to the heat sink that you saw in the previous video. There's only 2 small screws, one here in this corner, right next to the corner of this fan, and one right here on top, which is beside the screw that comes in from the top orange piece on this one. Just these 2 here, this one and this one, need to come out, and this case will come out. Now you got a little piece of plastic here, a little trim piece of plastic here that comes out along with the piece on the fan. Just remember that when you're putting this in, it's a little bit of a juggling act. So we found it easier to put this end of the board in first, kind of slide it in at an angle because this side piece is fixed. Get this piece in, and then kind of maneuver this one. It's kind of like playing a little bit of a puzzle because you kind of have to get it all to line up. But when you do, it should just drop into place. And what we're going to do next is we're going to get this orange cover back in, which, as long as you've assembled it correctly and you've got your screws in the bottom of the board in the right place, this will snap in place, as you can hear it here. All right, perfect. This will get held back in when you put the screw in. But there we go, that's the piece we're looking for. So when you're getting this cover orange piece to come out, I found it easy that you'll notice you get a little bit of a gap here once you take this screw out. Is to put a flat blade screwdriver in this seam and just kind of give it a little bit of a twist, and it'll pop the clips loose on the side and allow you to take this piece out. Now your LCD screen is held in by a ribbon cable, and it's got this little gray tab, at least on this one, that kind of folds down and locks that ribbon cable in place. So we're going to push that up, and be careful with this LCD screen. We don't want to crack it. We also do not want to damage our ribbon cable. Now what we're trying to do, is we want to get our ribbon cable in there. It's going to be hard to do on camera. I'm going to get a ribbon cable seated, and then it'll slide into place just like it did there. Once it's slid into place, and I apologize, this is going to be kind of hard to capture, we can then lock our retaining clip, or a little gray bar back down, retaining bar, retaining clip, however you want to call it, and it'll lock that ribbon cable back into place. Now, it's hard to see it on here, but you can tell that pulled out a little bit. That did not seat correctly, so we're going to pull that back up, because this was setting off at an angle, which isn't good. And what we want to do is sneak that guy down in there. Make sure this stays up and doesn't try to lock in place on you. Okay, and we're back. So again, what you do is that gray bar is be flipped up, and this ribbon cable has a little bit of a reinforcement piece on it that you can kind of use just to seat this in place, and you'll feel it drop in and seat in place. When that happens, you can push a little gray retaining bar back down, and that'll hold that cable back in place. But again, be careful. It is a ribbon cable. They are fragile, and the LCD screen in general can be damaged easily. What I've got here is just a hand sanitizing wipe. It's got isopropyl alcohol in it. We're going to use just to get our fingerprints and everything else off that LCD screen. It is isopropyl alcohol, so it's perfectly fine to use on electronics. There we go. Now, the top part of this screen, as you saw in the previous video, it's just double-sided or glue, double-sided tape / sticky glue. What I had to do on this one was heat it up with a hot air gun, just pass it over the edges for about 3 minutes, just keep it moving, keep it alternating so you're not heating up, or you don't want to inadvertently heat the LCD screen up too much and break it, but just keep it to the edges. You can see here, this is where it seals in place, where it sits. Just keep the heat gun moving. Once I got it warm to the touch, then I was able to get in with a little bit of a screwdriver, break the glue loose in the corner, and then just work around the edges. Now, if you're going to use a screwdriver, be careful. You don't want to snag this ribbon cable, and you don't want to gouge in the LCD screen or do any damage. It would probably be better if you had like a trim removal tool from automotive work, or a small thin piece of plastic, maybe the edge of an ATM card or something, and you could just slide it underneath just to break this glue loose. We're going to grab our 4 screws here. And apologies for getting the stitches in the hand into the shot. A little bit of an accident a few weeks ago. A pair of pruning shears. And there's 4 screws here that hold this plastic lid into place, besides the snaps. There we go. We're just going to press this back in place and use the existing glue. No need to add more. And we'll use that same hand sanitizing wipe to help clean up our screen. So let's give it a shot. Power supply connector goes on top. Battery output is on the side, and our balance lead. There we go. We got a screen. Everything looks good. We'll start a discharge test on the headway that we have attached here. We should have enough juice in it to get it to see if we can get you a little bit better view on that. And usually once this gets up to about 103 degrees Fahrenheit, normally that cooling fan will kick in at that point. It's 92 and climbing. It's 99, 100, 101, a few more degrees here and it should start. There we go. Newer one's hard to hear, but you can see it's starting to ramp up that fan, increasing the duty cycle. And that's perfect. We're going to let this run for a little bit and we'll come back with either a yay or a nay. I'll be back in a bit.